Pesachim Daf Nun. We're going to complete this perek and begin the next one. We're just finishing off a couple of points from the last Mishnah, which was about Nisuch HaMayim when done on Shabbat. Right? We still do Nisuch HaMayim even on Shabbat. The only difference is that we go and draw the water on Friday, bring it to the Beit haMikdash and leave it there overnight, Friday night. And that way, we don't have to go out and carry it and bring it on Shabbat itself. There's no need to violate Shabbat for that. So that's the law. Now, the Mishnah added one particular detail, which is that the vessel that we use to draw the water and transport it and store it overnight is an unconsecrated vessel. Do not use a consecrated vessel. Why? So the Gemara is assuming we know all this already, that because if you use a consecrated vessel, anything you put in a consecrated vessel becomes itself kadosh. And then if the water is consecrated, you have a problem of lina, of staying overnight. No overnights for liquids, for water that is consecrated. Once it stays overnight, you can't use it anymore. However, if you use an unconsecrated vessel, then it's okay. It's just regular water. And the next day, I'll transfer it into a consecrated vessel, and then I'll pour it onto the mizbeach, and that will be okay. Good. So that's our starting point. And now we ask, Ve'amai, naiteh bim kudeshet. Why do you have to do that? Why can't you bring it in a consecrated vessel? And there's a couple of ways around it. Here's two ways. One is that there's a law regarding the measurement. The yayin, nisuch hamayim is 3 lugim. So there's one opinion that says when you put the water in a vessel, even in a consecrated vessel, the water only becomes kadosh if it's exactly 3 lugim, because then it's clear, oh, this is going to be used for nisuch hamayim. But if it's more, then it doesn't get consecrated. So you could use a consecrated vessel, and if you follow that opinion, you'll still be okay. Or there's yet another opinion that says you need intention in order for the water to become consecrated. Even when you put it into a consecrated vessel, you could just not have in mind that it won't be consecrated, and that'll be okay. So there's two opinions that we could follow, and then that if we follow either of those two opinions, then we can use a consecrated vessel. So to explain that, Amazeli kasabar en shiur lamayim uchle sharet mekadeshin shelom idat. So Zaidi says that the Tana of our Mishnah must hold the following two assumptions. One is that there is no specific measurement for water. I mean, it has to be at least 3 lugim, but if you put more, then it's fine. You could pour more, and therefore, if I put 4 lugim, it's still going to become consecrated. So I don't have that out. And furthermore, our Tana of the Mishnah must think that kle sharet mikadeshin, that whatever you put in a consecrated vessel becomes consecrated, even if you don't have in mind, even without intent. Good. So our Mishnah does make sense only as long as you follow both of these limitations. Okay. Now we don't really like limiting ourselves to only some opinions. We'd rather be according to all opinions. So that's what we're going to do in a second. And then we just finish the clarification. If you bring it and it's consecrated and the water becomes consecrated, then you're going to have a problem of sleeping overnight. Good. Now, Chizkiah Amar, Kele Sharet en Mekadeshin Elamidat. Chizkiah says, no, the Aratana can even follow the other opinion that says consecrated vessels only make kadosh when you have intention to make them kadosh. And so therefore, really, from the letter of the law, you could use a consecrated vessel, draw the water, and I'll just have in mind that the water won't become kadosh. And then I could leave it overnight. So why does the Mishnah say not to? That's a Rabbanan. The people looking, they're not going to know what you had in mind, what the Kohen had in mind, or whoever, the person drawing the water. It doesn't have to be a Kohen, right? That person, we don't know what he had in mind when he put it into that vessel, if it was to be Kadosh or not. They're going to assume he did mean it for it to be Kadosh. And then they're going to see, oh, look, it stayed over Friday night. How could they do that? And then they're going to learn the wrong halacha. So that's why it's really because of Here it says Gezerah Shema. In the Talmud Yerushalmi and B'Yochanan, it's more like a Marit Ayin. But Marit Ayin and Gezerah are kind of related. In this case, really, the category Marit Ayin makes more sense, that they're going to assume he did something wrong. Gezerah Shema assumes that they're going to do it themselves. But nobody's doing it. This only the Kohanim are doing Yisuch HaMayim. Presumably, they know the background and they know why it's allowed or why it's not allowed, and they're not going to come to make a mistake. Or maybe they would, over time. Maybe not every family knew the laws as well. Okay, Amar bi Anai, Amar bi Zera, afilu tema yeshi or lamayim. But no, Rabbi Anai says we can even undo the other assumption that you had, and we can say that there has to be exactly 3 lugim of water in order for the water to be consecrated. So you could just put more and then it won't be consecrated. And we can even follow, our Tanakh can even follow that opinion. And we can assume Uchlesheret and Mekadishin Elamidat. In other words, we'll reject both of the Bizera's assumptions, and still, why not use a consecrated vessel? Person looking on will say, oh, look, they have this vessel, they put in more than 3. They probably put it in there for the Kohen to wash his hands and feet. Usually they would use a kiyor, but Kohen Gadol used another vessel on Yom Kippur, which was only a few days before. So people might think that, oh, they used this for Kiddush Yadayim B'Raglayim, which is consecrated, even if it's more, and usually they would have in mind that they would be consecrated. And then the people are going to say, oh, look, they filled it up for that, and now they're using it for Yisuch HaMayim on the next day. And so because they don't really know, it's not apparent what it's being used for, they're going to assume it was consecrated, even though it wasn't. So the whole thing is just a problem of a Marit Ayin or a Gezerah. Good, that explains that. Now, the very last part of the Mishnah said, if you filled it up Friday night and you put it in the Beit haMikdash, but it spilled, someone knocked it over, or if it was left open overnight, both of those are no good. If it's left open, we're afraid that a snake came and put venom in it. This is a general halacha, even for personal matters. If you have water next to your bed, and in the olden days, if it's left uncovered, we do worry there was a real threat that a poisonous snake might put some venom in it. This does not apply nowadays. This is an interesting halacha that the reason doesn't apply, and therefore the halacha is actually did change. So you can leave some water open as long as you don't have any snakes around. Okay, so in that case, in the Beit HaMikdash, we would just get some water from the kiyor, and that's fine also. That water is perfectly usable for Nisuch HaMayim, which we pointed out, which makes us wonder, why did they have to go all the way out to Meshiloach and bring it in? Because they wanted to make a huge festive party out of it. Number one, because it is happy, and number two, to stick it in the face of the people that disagreed of the minim who disagreed with this. Okay, now we ask, Ve'amai le'aver b'msanenet. Why do you have to get rid of it and can't use it? Why not put it through a filter? And the filter will filter out any possible snake venom that was inside. Must be that our Mishnah disagrees with Rabbi Nechemiah, and we're going to see his opinion. Rabbi Nechemiah says you can use a filter, so it must be we disagree with them. Let's see the source. The Tanya mesanenet yesh bo mishum gilui. The Tanakh Kama says that using a filter is considered leaving it exposed. A filter might take a long time to go down. So in the meantime, it's exposed. So using a filter, yeah, you'll take out the venom, but now you're leaving it exposed, so it's no good. Amar Rabbi Nechemiah, ematay bizman she'atachtona migula, ava bizman she'atachtona mechusa, afa pi she'alyona migula, en ba mishum gilui. Rabbi Nechemiah says we only consider it exposed when the basin underneath is left open. In other words, you have a large basin and the filter is smaller. So you're pouring into the filter, but all around you have open air. Right. But if the bottom one is covered with the filter is the same size as the opening of the basin, so then it's no problem, because even if a snake would come, the filter would filter out the venom. And so that's considered like it's covered. Poison of a snake is like a sponge. It floats in place and it won't go down. And so therefore that's considered covered. So if Rabbi Nechemiah was the author of a Mishnah, then it wouldn't make sense, because just because it was left open, so what? So put it in a filter. And the fact that the Mishnah doesn't give us that option means that it must be like Tanakh Kama and against Rabbi Nechemiah. But again, we don't want to limit the Mishnah. We want to save Rabbi Nechemia. Afilu tema Rabbi Nechemia, ema tema Rabbi Nechemia lehediot, aval lagavoa mi amad. No, Rabbi Nechemia only said his leniency for idiots. Hediot is the Hebrew word that comes from the Greek word, which is also the origin of our word idiot. It means here a common person, right? For a regular person, they have some water, it was left open, maybe there's venom, fine, go ahead and filter it out, and then you can drink it. But when we're giving it as an offering to Hashem, would he agree? Would he say that? Famous pasuk from Malachi says, would you offer this to your governor if you wanted to give a gift, right? Would he accept it, right? Could you imagine you go to a fancy restaurant and they serve you some water and they say, listen, there might be some snake venom in the soup here, but don't worry, we filtered it out, right? Would you accept such a dish, right? Maybe for a common person in the street, and they were used to having dirty water and filtered out, but you wouldn't offer this to an important guest. So all the more so, you should not offer this to Hashem. Again, even though Hashem is not drinking it, still for us, we should offer him something that is important for us, because that shows our gratitude and the significance that we give to this mitzvah. All right, good. That's a nice note to end on. Hadran alach lulav va'arava. Good. So this Mishnah, this Perek began with a Mishnah listing lulav and arava, how many days each one occurs, but we didn't actually finish all the items on the list. So strangely enough, the next Perek begins with a quote from the first Perek, the first Mishnah of the previous Perek, that said Hechalil Chamisha Veshisha. And so again, it's almost like this Mishnah, the Mishnayot have a starting Mishnah that given short, and the Mishnah itself unravels. The Mishnah itself is kind of a commentary on the first Mishnah, and yet there's a Perek, a paragraph, a chapter break within the Mishnah, even though we're continuing to talk about the same theme. And in general, the theme is all these things that we do. Do we do them on Shabbat, or do we not do them on Shabbat? All right, so Nisuch HaMayim we do even on Shabbat, but not so for the flute. Hechalil Chamisha Veshisha, playing the flute, which was done accompanying the drawing of the water to bring added celebration, is not done on Shabbat and not done on Yom Tov. Therefore, if Shabbat and Yom Tov coincide, then the other 6 days you would play the flute. If there's Yom Tov and then Shabbat Chol HaMoed, then that knocks out 2 days from the 7, and then you would only be playing the instruments for 5 days. It says flute, but it's talking about the whole orchestra. The flute seemed to be the loudest, most important, like in a modern orchestra. The first violinist, right, is the leader of the pack. So to then the flute was the leader. To be clarified, we're not talking about trumpets. Trumpets are a separate instrument that were necessary to blow with korbanot in general, and those were blown by kohanim, and those were necessary, so those were blown on Shabbat. We're talking here about all the other instruments, and we're going to talk about whether they were necessary or not for korbanot, but for just the happiness of the holiday and the Bet HaShoeva and drawing of water, they were not absolutely necessary, and therefore do not override Shabbat. So Zeu HaChalil Shabbat HaShoeva She'eno Doche Lo Et HaShabbat Velo Et Yom Tov. So that's what the Mishnah is clarifying. When we say flute here, we're talking about the flute specifically of the drawing of the water. That is not so important, and therefore does not override Shabbat or Yom Tov. The Mishnah does imply that maybe there's another type of flute playing that would. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about in the Talmud. Here's a picture of someone playing an ancient flute. Looks like it's a double flute. I could play harmony with it. All right. Itemar Rav Yehuda veRav Ayana Had Taneh Sho'eba veChad Taneh Hashuva. Okay, this word in the Mishnah that said these are the flutes for Simchat Bet HaSho'eva. This word itself there's two versions of it. Some say sho'eva, which is for the drawing of the water. Some say it's actually pronounced chashuva. These words don't look alike at all, but maybe they sound a little alike, and you can see how maybe it was memorized differently. So what do they mean? The one who recites this, memorizes the Mishnah as shoeva, he's not wrong, and the one chashuva also not wrong. There's two valid versions of the Mishnah. This opens up a whole methodological question. Was there one final version of the Mishnah? And that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said, this is it, and that, and then everything else is just a mistake. Or maybe even originally there were multiple versions that different schools at the time had remembered it slightly this way or slightly that way, and there was and there were various valid possibilities that were going around. I mean, some mistakes also. I'm not talking about the mistakes, but there could be more than one valid version of the Mishnah. And this would seem to be a case where that is in fact the case. The one who says sho'eva, that comes from this pasuk that you draw water with joy, and that means playing instruments while we're drawing the water. We saw this pasuk in the previous perek. So to call this the important thing, yes, it is in fact called an important mitzvah because it derives from the 6 days of creation. This goes back to the opinion that said that the pit underneath, those drain pipes underneath the mizbeach, where the water and wine go down, were there from the 6 days of creation, and therefore this ritual of pouring water in it, we pour wine in it all year round, but this is one time we pour water in it. This is kind of like a recreation of creation, right? When the waters are split and some go up and some go down, and so therefore this is a really essential and important mitzvah, so it's worthy to call it chashuva, and that's why it's worthy to make a big celebration with it. Tenor Rabbanan, hechalil dochet Shabbat, divrei Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. Good. Now we're going to have a general machloket about playing instruments on Shabbat, Shabbat all year round. So the first opinion, the Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda says, yes, instruments override Shabbat. Right? We want to make everything nice and celebratory, especially when we're going to say, let's say Hallel, or if it's Rosh Chodesh, right? But even otherwise, for Mizmor Shir, Yom HaShabbat. And Chachamim say, no, it does not flutes and instruments do not override Shabbat or Yom Tov, not even Yom Tov, which is less stringent than Shabbat. No instruments, not on Shabbat and not on Yom Tov. Okay, so that's a machloket in the Braita. Amar Rav Yosef, machloket bashir shel korban. So the Amorah Rav Yosef explains that this controversy is talking about playing instruments while making sacrifices, making the korban tamid, the korban musaf. That's what they're arguing about. The Rabbi Yosef savar ikar shira bichli v'avodahi v'dochat haShabbat. Rabbi Yosef says, when you're talking about song, the main part of song is the instruments. The chazan singing is also nice, but you can't. It's just singing with vocals. That's not a song. The instruments are necessary, and it's an essential part of the service of the sacrifice, and therefore it's doche Shabbat, right? Just like you're allowed to do shechita, you're allowed to burn, you're allowed to cook, you're allowed to do everything that is necessary in the Beit HaMikdash, and that includes song, and song these instruments. So all this is permitted. They agree that you have to sing while you're doing the sacrifices, but they say that a cappella is good enough. That's sufficient. And therefore, instruments are not an essential part of the service, and therefore, it does not override Shabbat. The truth is that playing instruments, as we understand in the Bavli, is only a d'Rabbanan. You might come to fix it, which d'Rabbanan might be even more lenient in the Beit HaMikdash. But nevertheless, there's different kinds of Rabbanan. Some of them because you might come to do something. Some of them are not in the spirit of Shabbat. It's not Shavut. So if in fact it's not necessary for the sacrifice, then you can't play instruments on Shabbat. But regarding playing instruments just for drawing the water, everyone agrees that's only to bring added happiness to that mitzvah, but is not a necessary part of it. And therefore, even the Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda would agree with our Mishnah that for Sukkot, Zimhat Bet HaShoeva, we do not play instruments. Good. Amar Rav Yosef. Mina amina debeha pelige. I said, Rav Yosef, he just said this. He just said what we read. And now he's bringing an added proof, right? How do I know that this is in fact the matter that they're dealing with? Whether you need instruments for song or you don't need instruments for song? The Tanya, I have another application. Keleh sharet she'asa'an shel eitz. Rabbi posel Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda machshir. In general, vessels, temple vessels that are made out of wood, like you have, the bowl that you go to collect the blood and take it. Can they be made out of wood? Usually they're made out of gold and silver. But what if I want to make it wood? Is it okay? Rabbi says no. Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda, that's the same as the person here, Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda, who said that you can use instruments, that you can. He says, he also happens to say that yes, you can use wood. So maybe there's a correlation between these two opinions. Okay, this is an interesting concept. So apparently there was a flute from the time of Moshe made out of reed, and they kept it in the Beit haMikdash. And the question is, can we use that as a model? So the one that says it's permitted, that's the Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. He says you need instruments in order to have song, and therefore, since one of the key instruments is a flute, and we have the flute of Moshe, which is an example, which is a model. Therefore, just like you have an instrument that's made out of wood, and you can use it as a temple vessel, so too, anything else that you want to make out of wood is also permitted. And the other opinion that says it's no good, that's the B, that you cannot make bowls out of wood. He must think that the main song is vocal and you don't need instruments. And therefore, yes, it's very nice. Moshe had a reed flute, but it has no halachic significance for us because the instruments are good for during the week, but there was no need to use it on Shabbat. And therefore, we would not learn from the flute that all other vessels can be also made out of wood. Okay, so it's nice to see this correlation because it happens to be the same Tana, but we reject it, not necessarily. Maybe, in fact, everybody agrees that you have to have instruments in order to have song. And the difference between them is, are we going to learn a possible situation from an impossible situation? The idea is like this. For a flute, you can't have a flute made out of metal. It'd be called a trumpet. It's a different thing. But a reed flute, right, a nai, has to be made out of wood. Otherwise, it won't sound good. And so therefore, for that, there's no other choice. We have to make that out of wood. But for the other bowls, you can make them out of metal. So one opinion will say, the one who says that's permitted, that's the Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. He would say that we can learn, even though it's true, for a flute, you have to make it out of wood. Nevertheless, we can derive from that you can make bowls out of wood also, even though you could make bowls out of other things. And the other opinion will say, no, that's not a good place to learn from. The flute, you have no other choice. You have to make it out of wood. That's why it's made out of wood. But everything else, you can make it out of other metal. So then you can't use wood. And so that's really what they're arguing. And they're not necessarily arguing on about the same two opinions here that Rav Yosef said. These could be independent controversies. And yet another way to explain their controversy regarding wood. Both of these Tanaim think that yes, that the opposite of what we just said, that it's a cappella is the main thing, so you don't need vessels. You don't need instruments, and you do not learn an impossible situation from a possible one. So then, what is the machloket about whether you can make vessels out of wood or only metal? So they're arguing nothing to do with instruments or the flute. All that is irrelevant because you could just sing. So rather, the thing that they're arguing on is the menorah. Can we learn from the menorah that it has to be made out of metal, or can we learn even that it can be made out of wood? Okay, now you're wondering, what are you talking about? We know the Torah. It says the menorah has to be made out of gold. So why would you think you can make it out of anything else? The answer is because there in the Torah, we're going to see that there's a general statement, a general phrase, followed by a particular, followed by a general. And you have this many times. Anytime you have this, it's a little confusing. So like, what Torah, what do you want me to do? Should I follow the general and then be inclusive, or the particular? In this case, the particular is gold and only gold, but then you have a general thing. So how do I make a compromise? So there's two methodologies that are used in Tanaitic Midrash. One is called Kelal Upirat. And this was the one that was advanced by the school of Rabbi Akiva. Of Rabbi Ishmael. Klal Uprat is used by the school of Ishmael, or Beribuye u'mi'oteh mipalgeh. The other system is Ribuy and Mi'ot. And that was used mostly by the school of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, here we don't have Rabbi Ishmael or Rabbi Akiva. This is now later generations of Tanaim. And here's a great example of how to apply these two methodologies and how they come to a different outcome. So it's actually really important methodological sugya. Rabbi dedaresh kalale uferate. Rabbi uses kalal uprat. Even though Rabbi technically is a student of Rabbi Akiva, sometimes Rabbi Ishmael, all his opinions also were used. And Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda, the one before that says you're allowed to use instruments and you're allowed to make things out of wood. Daresh ribuye u'mi'oteh. Okay, ribuy mi'ut in general is a bit more, it leaves more room for creativity. And so let's see how they work. Rabbi daresh kelale u'prateh. Ve'asita menorat. So that's the generality. Make a menorah. If I just had those words, I make it however I want, right? Go, kindergarten class, you make it out of tubes of paper towels, make it whatever. Kelal. Zahav tahor perat, but then the middle word says has to be gold. But then after that it says miksha te'aseh menorah. You should make it one piece. Beat it. Don't glue it together. One piece. One piece sounds like anything. So now chazaru ve'kalal, that's a generality. So how do I interpret this? Kelal uperat ukelal I atadan ela ke'ayin haperat. Whenever you have that type of format, it means that we want to use anything that is in some way similar to the particular. Ma perat meforash shel matechet, afkol shel matechet. And how do we do that? The middle phrase says gold. So what's like gold? Anything that's made out of metal, any type of metal is like gold. Gold was just one example of metal. So that's the compromise between the general and the particular, any kind of metal, but not wood. So that's the opinion. That's the B follows the opinion that says we use peratu klal, and therefore no wood. And just like the menorah cannot be made out of wood, so too any of the other vessels of the Beit HaMikdash cannot be wood. Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda daresh ribuye u'mi'oteh ve'asita menorat riba zahav tahor mi'et miksha te'aseh menorah chazar v'riba. So instead of the terms kelal and parat, he uses ribuy and mi'ut. They mean kind of the same thing, but their application is a bit different. So asita menorah comes to include something. That's an inclusive word. Zahav tahor is an exclusive word. Miksha te'aseh menorah, it shall be made. It shall be made, especially in the passive. It is an inclusive phrase. So chazar v'riba, riba u'mi'et v'riba, riba hakol. My rabbe kol mileh, my mi'at shel chayres. So you have a lot of inclusive. That means you include everything. Wait, but you also have the exclusive word. So you have to exclude something. What are we going to exclude? No clay, no earthenware. That is not allowed. So you see, ribuy mi'ut ribuy just is actually more inclusive altogether, and therefore wood is in the inclusive part. So wood is totally fine. You can use wood for the menorah and for other kelim. Okay, so really fascinating the way that we learn this. I'd like to go on a few more lines just because this continues the same theme and it's pretty early. So, Amar Rav Papa, Ketanae Detanya Avde Chohanim Hayu. So this dispute that we just saw is parallel to yet another controversy that talks about who served as the musicians in the Beit HaMikdash. we're going to have three opinions. So far, here we have two. One says it was the slaves of the Kohanim. The Kohanim themselves weren't necessarily great musicians, but their slaves were. Maybe they'd make sure to go and acquire servants who were great musicians. Okay, they really like their music. Rabbi Yosef Omer, משפחת בית הפגרים ומשפחת בית סיפריה ומאמנום היו שהיו מסיעים לכהונה. So Rabbi Yosef says these were Israelites, these certain families that were important, and they married into Kohanim. In those days, not like today, Kohen will just marry Yisrael just like that. We see this all the time. In those days, the Kohanim would make sure to try to marry only other Kohanim or families that were very distinguished. So these people are from the city outside Jerusalem, and so these were special families, but they were Yisrael. Next opinion says, Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos Omer, Leviim hayu. No, they were Leviim. All right. So now we have three opinions. Either they were slaves of Kohanim, married to Kohanim, or they were Leviim. Now, what's the difference between them? The one who says they were Leviim, that means that he must assume that instruments are integral to the one who says that they are slaves must think that a cappella is good enough, because you'll have the Leviim, they're singing a cappella. Who's playing the instruments? Slaves. Now, obviously, the instruments are not very important, because if they were important, then we wouldn't allow servants to be playing the instruments. It would have to be done by Leviim. So therefore, that opinion, the one who says slaves, follows the opinion before that says the vocals are the most important. And the one here who says, Bichanina ben Antignos, who says that they were Leviim, they were playing instruments, he must hold of the opinion that says the instruments are the main part of the song, and that's why it has to be Leviim. You can't allow just servants to be doing this essential thing. Okay, so that would make sense for those two opinions, but we left out the opinion before that says it was Yisraelim that were married to Kohanim. What would Rabbi Yosef say about this? If he thinks that it's that the vocals are the most important, then why would he have to say that these were important families? He could even agree that they would be servants. And if he thinks that the instruments are essential, then he would have to agree that they are Leviim, and you can't use Yisrael. So Yisrael is kind of this in-between category. Do you need it, or do you need instruments or not? If you need them, Leviim. If you don't need them, it can be servants. What's the point of requiring Yisraelim? So rather, everyone agrees that the vocals are the most important. And so what they're arguing about history. What happened to be, right? It happened to be that the servants, they were really good musicians, so they did it, right? Maybe servants, maybe they're from other countries that they imported, and they had lots of musical knowledge. And they brought the different makamat from different places, different cities, who knows? And the other one said, no, it happened to be that these certain families were good. The other one said, no, it happens to be the Leviim. So they're arguing about history. It's really interesting, right? I mean, when I first read it, I was like, yeah, they're arguing about history. But for the Gemara, why would you record something historical? Who cares, right? If it doesn't have a halachic value, then why would you bother? So, okay, only now that we couldn't fit it into the different shitot, so we said, well, maybe they're talking about what happened in the past. But we're not satisfied with that. What's the practical difference in halacha? The difference is if we're not sure of someone's status, right? Are they Jewish or not? Are they a Levi or not? Well, if someone comes and says, "Oh, I know that guy's father. I know that guy's grandfather. He used to play the flute in the Beit haMikdash." So, based on that, can we assume that they're Jewish? If you follow the one who says that they are from those Israelite families, then you know that they're Jewish. Can we give maaser to that person, right? Maaser Rishon that you give to a Levi? Well, let's see. If you follow the opinion that they were Leviim, then if their father or grandfather played instruments, they must be a Levi, and yes, you can give it to them. The one who said if they're servants, then you can't assume anything about them, right? Then just because, okay, their grandfather was the best musician, doesn't mean anything regarding their lineage. So the one who says that the people that played instruments were servants, just because someone's ancestor played an instrument doesn't mean anything. The one who says that was for Israelite families, then if we know that his father played instruments, you know he's Jewish. But we don't know he's a Levi, so we can't give him Maser. The one who says that the people who play instruments were in fact Leviim, according to that, if we know that his grandfather's great-grandfather played instruments, then we can now assume that he is Jewish, and we can even give him Ma'aser. See, so after all, this wasn't just a historically interesting fact. There is halachic significance to it as well. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.